Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 24. May 25th is National Wine Day. As one of my online course students recently noted, as if we needed an official day to celebrate the drink most of us love year-round. Agreed. That said, I think it's worth exploring how wine, as a beverage, has influenced our culture. You'll find a related interview with John Mahoney on his book, Wine, the Source of Civilization, in episode 21, so go back and have a listen if you missed that one. Most of what I'm going to share with you today is based on a magazine piece about wine and civility that I wrote 2 months after 9/11. However, I think the search for civility in everyday life has more resonance than ever, with seemingly daily mass shootings in various places around the world, the ongoing threat of ISIS, and the aggression that many women and others face daily on social media. I'm going to break this up into 2 episodes. This is part 1, and part 2 will be published on May 29th. I warmly welcome your thoughts on this audio essay. The trouble with moderation is that it's hard to get excited about it. Until now. After September 11th, finding the moderate and the civilized in everyday life has become all the rage. Few things embody these values more than wine and the food that we eat with it. A river of wine flows through most of human history, from the ancient clay jugs found buried beside the Nile to the glass of Cabernet accidentally tipped over while visiting websites about ancient Egypt. In the countries that make it, wine is part of the national customs, culture, literature, arts, religion, science, geography, and trade. As California vintner Robert Mondavi once noted, quote, "Wine has been with us since the beginning of civilization. It's the temperate, civilized, sacred, romantic mealtime beverage recommended in the Bible. Wine in moderation is an integral part of our heritage and a gracious way of life." End quote. And it's also one of the last true things we consume. Despite all the genetic engineering of our food these days, wine remains deeply connected with the land. The dinner table itself is a symbol of modern unity and tolerance. Throughout history, a person's position at the dinner table reflected the social hierarchy. The best seats and the best food and wine went to those with the most power. In contrast, King Arthur's court stood for, or at least sat, for equality since the knights gathered at a round table. Today, some of the best conversations happen at the table, and some of the most brilliant ideas are conceived there. Just as importantly, eating and drinking together helps us to understand people from other cultures through their wine and cuisine. Wine has long been a closer companion to food than has hard liquor or beer. The high alcohol content of hard liquor tends to overwhelm food, the reason it's often consumed on its own. Or to paraphrase, wine is fine, but liquor is quicker. Beer, though moderate in alcohol, has a narrower range of complementary aromas and flavors than wine. Food and wine matching came into vogue in the late 1800s, when French dinner hosts started serving with multiple courses and tried matching each with a different wine to heighten the gastronomic experience. Classic matches such as Stilton blue cheese and port soon emerged. Today, the fashion is to break the rules, but wine remains the best complement to food. Matching food and wine calls into play all of our senses, one of the few activities that connects our minds to our stomachs and livers. And in an age of passive entertainment, it's the only pleasure that we truly consume. Eating and drinking is something we need to do, unlike attending the opera, theater, or ballet. But when we infuse an animal need with camaraderie and creativity, we move from sustenance to cuisine. It becomes part of us. We turn it into blood, bone, and gesture, as the poet Rilke would say. It reminds us of how fleeting life is. No record of the food, wine, or conversation is left, only memory. Even the rituals of food and wine, such as the etiquette of which fork and knife to use, or the passing of a decanter of port clockwise around a dinner table to symbolize the passing of time, requires civility and a nod to those present, those who sat before us, and those who will sit when we are gone. Fine food and wine enable us to feel our capacity for joy and make us want to share that feeling with others. Who can imagine scarfing down a duck confit or duck à l'orange and a Burgundian Pinot Noir all alone? Wine is as cerebral as it is sensual. It begs for appreciation, reflection, and conversation. Most of its character is in the aroma, connecting to the areas of our brain responsible for memory and emotion. Drinking wine is, therefore, a full brain exercise, until it becomes a foggy brained exercise. The complexity of wine is also an exercise in memory. Take all the wine producing countries from both the Old World and New Worlds. Layer in the subregions, appellations, and quality designations of thousands of wineries and chateaux, all of which have different winemaking methods that vary according to the climate every year. Throw in hundreds of grape varieties, blends, and styles, including red, whites, rosé, sparkling, fortified, botrytized, late harvest, ice wine, and others. Wines to drink before, during, and after the meal. Wines for celebration, champagne for reflection, port. And then there are the other aspects, such as the chemistry of aging wine, decanting it, and matching it with food. The complexity of wine's charms are why many of our great literary minds, Plato, Aristophanes, Baudelaire, Byron, Dickens, Joyce, Hardy, Tolstoy, have all written more about wine than about any other type of alcohol. So powerfully can wine sharpen our feeling for life that we're also driven to quantify those feelings. We rate wine, but not orange juice. We analyze the differences soil and climate make to wine, but nobody cares where the cabbage was grown. That complexity makes some people disdain those so-called experts or wine snobs. True, some wine lovers have an unfortunately low emotional intelligence quotient. But we don't dislike those who know a lot about fly fishing, for example. We call them enthusiasts, not snobs. However, pleasure became the shadow of safety, pushed to the back of our minds when we watched the firefighters and the volunteers work their way through the rubble of the World Trade Center towers. In fact, September 11th caused many people to reevaluate what was important in their lives and what wasn't. And many in the hospitality industry, including myself, wondered if our work still had meaning. After all, weren't food and wine now trivial? But food and wine remain an important expression of Western culture. Making wine is a Western industry. Drinking wine, a Western habit. For instance, not one of the countries that America considers a sponsor of terrorism produces wine. Iran doesn't, nor do Iraq, Syria, Libya, North Korea, or the Sudan. Nor do the countries where UN peacekeeping forces are stationed, such as Central Africa and the Western Sahara. So are only countries that make wine civilized? Certainly not. Some don't produce wine because their climate isn't suitable, and others don't because their religious convictions don't allow it. And although practicing Muslims don't drink wine because the Quran considers it, quote, a satanic device, the devout are rewarded with it in the afterlife. In paradise, there are, quote, rivers of wine, a delight to those who drink, end quote. In fact, it's believed that Muslim alchemists first developed the technique of distillation and later taught it to Spanish explorers. The techniques were preserved in monasteries through the Middle Ages, much like Europe's literature and culture from that time. But the first known civilizing influence of wine goes back to the 3rd millennium BCE. The Sumerian epic poem Gilgamesh tells of Enkidu, a wild man who became civilized when a temple whore gave him wine to drink. The god of wine, Dionysus for the Greeks and Bacchus for the Romans, was also part of ancient myth. Like Christ, Dionysus was said to be the son of an immortal god, in his case Zeus, and a human, Semele. Both Bacchus and Christ are symbolized by the vine, which dies each winter and is reborn the next spring. In fact, in the Bible, Christ says, quote, I am the true vine, end quote. Wine's ability to civilize, as well as its high price, have also made it the drink of power, from the Egyptian pharaohs to European royalty. Traditionally, peasants drank beer and hard liquor, and even today, if politicians want to portray themselves, quote, of the people, they share a pint in a pub with working stiffs, rather than sipping an aristocratic glass of wine. In the New World, European explorers used hard liquor to colonize the new land instead of sharing wine to civilize it. The name Manhattan comes from a native word meaning island of general intoxication. I love that. Having recently returned from New York City, I can attest to the fact that that island still lives up to its name today. Great restaurants. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson, who cultivated French vines at his Virginia home, hoped that wine, the drink of moderation, would replace whiskey as the preferred drink of Americans. He commented that, quote, no nation is drunken where wine is cheap, and none sober where the dearness of wine substitutes ardent spirits as the common beverage, end quote. The advocates of prohibition ignored that wisdom to their eventual detriment 100 years later when they dumped wine into the same category with all demon drink. All right, I'm going to leave it there for now, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. On May 29th, I'll continue this discussion, so I'd love to hear from you in the meantime. And I'll give you a shout out on the next podcast if you do. We'll take a repose, so to speak, next week with a guest interview on pairing wine and yoga with Morgan Perry. She's a delight. You can tag me on Twitter or Facebook at Natalie McLean, and on Instagram, I'm at Natalie McLean Wine. You'll find links and resources in the show notes for this episode at nataliemclean.com/24. Now, if you like this episode, please tell a friend about it. Think of somebody who is also interested in these larger issues about wine and culture. And mention my podcast. It's easy to find whether you search on its name, Unreserved Wine Talk, or on my name. Finally, if you want to take your wine and food pairing to the next level, join me in a free online video class at nataliemclean.com/class. I can't wait to share more personal wine stories with you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this one, and I hope something great is in your glass this week. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now. at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.